I am Margaret Lowe. I am the CEO of WBUR, and welcome to CitySpace for all of you in the room and everybody with us virtually. It is so meaningful to have all of you here. Thank you for your belief in WBUR. We simply could not do, as you hear us often say, we could not do this without you. And our mission is to produce high-quality journalism and enriching experiences that deepen understanding, connection, and community. And we're going to have an experience tonight that I think, on this beautiful September evening, that I think will satisfy all. And speaking of beautiful September evenings, it is finally feeling like fall. At least it's not raining. Although my belief is that if there were a nor'easter, we couldn't have been able to keep people away from coming to see Heather Cox Richardson, because she is a bit of a rock star. So I am not at all surprised that there is a very full house tonight. She's described in the flap of her new book this way, Democracy Awakening. It says, and I think it's so perfect, it says, Richardson's talent is to wrangle our giant, meandering, and confusing news feed into a coherent story that singles out what we should pay attention to, what the precedents are, and what possible paths lie ahead. So this Boston College's history professor's talents are evident every single day in her newsletter, Letters from American. The Washington Post, I think it was yesterday, actually called her the queen of Substack. She has millions of readers. I happen to be one of them. I suspect many of you in this room are right there with me. But I have to say this, beyond her daily brilliance, which is astonishing, I can't help but notice the timestamp of when she sends the newsletter. So, 1:15 a.m., 2:28 a.m. this morning, 3:48 a.m. It is rare that her newsletter lands in my inbox or our inboxes before midnight, and I feel a sigh of relief every time it does. So I think one of the most pressing questions that Meghna could ask Heather Cox Richardson is, when and do you ever sleep? I'm counting on you. Speaking of Meghna, Meghna Chakrabarti, who is no stranger to this audience, Meghna Chakrabarti is a world-class, award-winning journalist, host of WBUR's On Point, a daily show that does a deep dive into some of the most consequential issues of our time. She is an extraordinary talent, and one of the things we talk about a lot is the importance of trust, the importance of having people on the air telling us stories whom we trust. I think these two women certainly fit that category. And with that, I am very delighted to pass you off into the trustworthy hands of Meghna Chakrabarti, here to talk to Heather Cox Richardson.
Good evening, everybody. One second here, please. I have now officially crossed over into the I need reading glasses phase of life. So I have to update my onstage flow here a little bit. So before I actually start asking Heather some questions, I wanted to just remind folks of procedure that obviously we want a lot of your questions. And so this is the one time where I will be okay with people using their phones during a public event. And you go to slido.com, SLIDO.com. Oh, there it is. Okay. And yes, use the hashtag Richardson. Now, I know that there are going to be far more questions that come in than we'll be able to get in there. But, you know, see if one of yours is the one that makes it here onto my screen, okay? So the very first time I met Professor Richardson was when her book about the history of the Republican Party came out. I don't even remember what year that
2014.
was. 2014. Okay. So I was hosting Radio Boston, and we thought, this is a really, really fascinating book. She came in, and I was just blown away we probably only talked for about 20 or 25 minutes, but I could have talked to her for 2 hours. And I just thought, when you meet someone who has an intellect that's so powerful, it's like they almost shine. That's how I felt when I met you.
Well, I have to laugh because there's someone here in the audience, and the what I was supposed to do that day was to come talk to you, but I had not checked my schedule. So I was literally leaving to go for a walk with somebody who's here in the audience, and this ad came across my screen that said that you were about to talk to Heather Cox Richardson in about 20 minutes. And I was like, oh, expletive. And I came through the door, and I think I said to your sound person, if I have a cardiac event, could you please?
Well, I thank God that you did not, because I have been a very profound fan of your work ever since then. So let me just get right to one of the questions that I would love to hear your answer to. In the future, will a future Heather Cox Richardson, not you, but someone who achieves the stature and in terms of the public mindset, look back at 2024 and pinpoint that year as the year that Americans either chose to hold fast to their democracy or to let it crumble?
Yes.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you should say that, though, because historians usually don't like to look at like one point in time and say the history of a nation pivoted on that moment.
Well, I'm not entirely sure we can say it pivoted there, as in we are building up to a moment when we have to choose. And many of us already have, and we are part of a longer set of a strand here. But yes, 2024 is enormously important. But there are a lot of things that are going to happen between now and 2024 that will help us direct where that is going to go.
And what particular things are you going to be looking at?
Well, many things, actually. There are, first of all, the black swan event, right? The something that might happen that we don't see coming and that's going to be huge. So if I had told you 3 years ago that Ukraine was going to be one of the most important countries in the global scene, you would have thought, well, I want whatever she's drinking, right? And yet, when Volodymyr Zelensky said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, it changed the world. And who knows? Who knows what's coming next, right? So there's the black swan events, but then there are also a bunch of legal cases that are going to be really important. Not only how they are decided, but how people react to how they are decided. Yes. So literally, less than 2 hours ago, a judge in New York handed down a summary judgment in a piece of Letitia James's lawsuit against the Trump Organization and the former president, and in that summary judgment has dissolved a number of Trump's businesses and put somebody in charge, a former judge, I think it is, in charge of overseeing the organization. That's going to have huge repercussions because it's going to really hurt the Trump Organization's ability to handle money, right? And handling money is crucial to that entire project.
Yeah.
So there's that. There's a number of things that are currently in process that we don't know how they will come out. And, that's things like the court cases are some of them.
Mm. So one of the powers of your letters every day is that it's not just contemporary, it's so much more than just contemporary analysis, right? You're coming at it from the deep knowledge of a historian. So I have been struggling over the past, 5 years now, but especially over the past few months, to try and figure out what historical framework should I be thinking through this period in the United States. So is there one that you look back on over the past couple of 100 years of American history that you find to be close in terms of us helping us understand what's happening now?
Yes, the place I always look to is the 1850s. But to take a bigger step back, I think one of the things that jumps out to me the more I look at what's happening in the world, but also in the United States right now, is that there's really kind of two ways to look at the world. Either you think that everybody should be treated equally before the law and have a right to a say in their government, or you believe that some people are better than others and should rule. I mean, it's a really simple way to look at the world. And if you're looking for a pattern in the United States, the 1850s were very much like the present. So, people say to me, well, how can we ever come out of this? And I'm like, if you had told somebody in 1853 what the world was going to look like just 10 years later, they would never have believed it, because in 1853 it really looked as if the elite enslavers had taken over the federal government and were going to make enslavement national. They were in fact going to become a world power. That was because they were the ones who controlled the most of the money. They were going to become a world power that spread their system around the world, and the entire enterprise of American democracy would have died. 1854, they push a little bit too hard. People like Abraham Lincoln wake up after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and say, wait a minute, we may not like each other, we may not agree about a lot of stuff, but we know we've got to save democracy. By 1856, they have a new political party. By 1858, somebody like Abraham Lincoln is beginning to articulate a vision for that party that is based in the fundamental documents of the United States, especially the Declaration of Independence. By 1859, he has articulated a new vision of the government. By 1860, he's in the White House, and by 1863, he has delivered the Gettysburg Address, dedicating the nation to a new birth of freedom based on the Emancipation Proclamation, which was unthinkable 10 years before. So when I look at the present, I look at, people say it's, they're so terrified now, and I'm like, I'm a happy little duck over here, because 10 years ago, when we were talking about things like the rise of the unitary executive or signing statements or any of the many things that were happening, people weren't paying any attention, and you couldn't get people to pay attention. And now people are not only paying attention, they're in the streets, and they're pushing back against gerrymandering, and they're doing all the things that I wish we'd been doing for the past 40 years. So that parallel is the one that really jumps out to me. People waking up and saying, we want to save democracy.
In 1853, though, lurking in the background, was there the potentially catalyzing threat of secession or war?
Absolutely.
So that was there. I mean, the rending of the nation was lurking.
Yes.
Do we necessarily have that now?
So that's a question people ask, are we going toward a civil war? And I think there are two ways to look at that. The first is this sort of war we had in 1860, no. For a simple reason, and that's that people forget that the reason we get secession is because the South Carolina legislature this is really in the weeds, but it's kind of cool.
That's why we read her, right?
In 1860, I should actually do a letter of all the things that I want to write about that nobody wants to read. So like I was so excited about writing today because there was this really cool story, and then like the news happened, and I'm like, that's so not fair, because now you're not going to know about Louis Brandeis. All right, but in 1860, South Carolina was the only state in the Union that chose its electors through the legislature, which meant that the legislature was sitting when Lincoln was elected. They instantly went from being a state legislature to being a secession convention, and they really pushed secession very hard, very quickly. This is in late November of 1860. What is that? That's not planting season in the South. That's when everybody puts on their fancy gowns and goes to Christmas parties and drinks a lot and boasts and tries to impress the ladies. So the South secedes really quickly before Lincoln is even inaugurated. And then nothing happens. So one of the reasons that the Confederacy fires on Fort Sumter in April is because planting season is starting, and they're afraid the whole thing's going to collapse. And the reason that I'm telling that is because the secession of the South in 1860 to 1861 is really fast. He has to hit really quickly. And I think that the former President Trump's administration, especially Steve Miller and Steve Bannon, tried to do that in January of 2017 with the travel ban, but it didn't work. It didn't work for really interesting reasons. And their moment was January 6, 2021. And when that moment passed, and now that we have the Department of Justice having charged more than 1,000 people and convicted, I forget how many hundreds at this point, that moment of we're going to do this because this is our moment to win, that moment passed. And I think that really matters, that everything has slowed down there. Now, that being said, people say, could it really be that we ever get into a shooting war? And my answer to that is, we're in one. I mean, the number of people in America who are dying every day to gun violence, not only politically motivated or racially motivated, but also domestic violence, which makes up more than half of our mass shootings. Most people don't realize that statistic. That's what historians are going to look at. And that I think really matters. So no, I don't think we're going to be lined up in the streets, but I think that aspect of our current society matters.
It's interesting to hear you say that the moment that the insurrection of January 6th offered has passed. Because I'm about to disagree with you.
I'm to disagree with you.
For a couple of reasons. I think one is that, A, it proved to people who are aligned with Trump and inclined to actually try to seek a violent change, that they can do it. Yes, there are many people who are on trial due to the very sort of concerted diligence of the Department of Justice. But in terms of broader ramifications beyond those individuals, I don't think the nation has actually seen that. And second of all, in our on point in our study of transitions from democracy to authoritarianism, a pattern has come up that the first attempt is the dress rehearsal for the second or third attempt to break down a democracy, which ultimately succeeds in nations that become authoritarian.
Well, it certainly could be, and there are a lot of scholars who say that that's the case. I am, quite frankly, less worried about that than I am about the takeover of what I would call the nodes of democracy in especially the states, gerrymandering and the electoral boards. Now, again, you look at where we are now, we have 14 months before the next election. How that's going to play out, I think, is unclear. We have a decision today from the Supreme Court throwing Alabama back its maps and saying, no, you really do have to redraw the maps. There's still a lot of places in play. I mean, I'm not saying that we're done, that everything is going to be good, but I'm also not saying everything's going to be bad. I'm saying we have to choose.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that choice a little bit more later. We've got the book, and we've got Heather's letter that comes out every day. I'm just going to ask the question now, just to be sure I don't forget. Do you sleep, and if so, when?
So, I do sleep. I do not sleep as much as I would like to sleep, and it's actually really sad that often after a long day, I put my head down on the desk, and I sleep with my head on the desk. and Buddy is here. And he will tell you, he's like, this is just not a good thing. And I will, after the election, I will sleep.
Okay, so just 13 or 14 months to go, no problem. So I want to talk about the genesis of your Substack. First of all, the name. Does it come from Tocqueville?
It comes from Crèvecoeur.
Oh, okay.
Letters from an American Farmer, which is that document from, I'm going to go with 1787, but I could easily be making that up at this point. Now I wonder. Somebody should check that. In which people are wondering what on earth a democracy is, because they're playing with these ideas, but what does that mean? What does it even look like? So he writes this book called Letters from an American Farmer that literally says, what is this American, this new man? And then it was also named for Alistair Cook's Letters from America.
Yeah.
Because what he did in those fabulous letters was, once a week, he would do a snapshot of the country at that moment. And it could be anything from a tattoo artist to what Truman was doing, but it was a snapshot for that week. And I thought that what I was trying to do was a snapshot for that day for a historian in 150 years. And I will tell you that my cutoff is midnight Eastern time. And nothing makes me more unhappy than when news drops at 11:59. Do you remember when Trump got COVID? And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, because they didn't announce it until about 11:58, figuring everybody was asleep. And I'm like, dude, that was so not fair. But then sometimes something happens just after midnight that affects what I've already written, and it kills me. But I'm like, no, I didn't know that at midnight, so I can't look at it until tomorrow. So that's
You're a really tough critic on yourself, because I've never read any of your letters as being moot or not relevant to the moment that I read it.
Well, so there are a number of people in history who have kept records, and they're really important historical documents. So you want to be sure that when you're putting something down for a day, it really happened that day. And so I try not to bleed over on either side, and sometimes it just kills me. Because something happened just a couple weeks ago, and a story broke about 3, and I was like, I can't. I gotta leave it the way it was.
Your sleep is actually more important than being on top of news that will never stop breaking. Welcome to our world, by the way.
Yes, but Buddy's the one who pointed this out to me. News broke of the Trump administration after Hannity went off the air. That's how I started writing so late. If you look at the old ones, I was always in bed by midnight. And then once things got bad, he broke stories after Hannity.
Yeah.
And it took me forever to realize that the Biden administration doesn't do that. They dump news on Monday. So Mondays are grim. And then usually nothing happens on Tuesday, but because I was dropping a book today, they decided they were going to dump a full year of news today. And then nothing happens on Wednesday. Really, there's almost nothing on Wednesdays. And then Thursday, anything big the administration's going to do drops on Thursday. And then Friday, they'll go home for the weekend. And so it's really clear Mondays and Thursdays are the biggies for this administration. And they rarely do things at night.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we're going to come back to Letters from an American in a second. I actually want to take a meandering trip around a little bit and ask you about you. What kind of kid were you when you were say like 10 and below?
Oh, so this is so bad because there are actually people in this audience who know the answer to that. So I was brilliant. I did everything my parents told me to. I never got in trouble. Went to bed on time. So what was I as a kid? I from the time I was little, I wanted to teach and write. I was a total bookworm, loved being outside, loved reading books, hated clothes, hated school, buying clothes and all that shit. Hated school more than anything on earth, still hate school, and had truly wonderful siblings and friends who indulged me.
You were an autodidact from the start then. Yeah?
I don't know. Yeah, maybe.
I'm wondering what all your students think about you hearing you saying, I hated school and I still do.
Well, actually, I think it makes me a better teacher, because my thing is, don't waste my time. Like, if I'm going to be in this room, teach me something. And I think that translates very well to a classroom, because I'm always aware that they could be doing anything else other than being in my classroom. And I think that shows in my writing. It's like, I'm not going to give you a sentence unless it's worth reading.
Yeah. We're going to talk about your writing process too in a moment. Are you teaching now as well?
I'm on leave right now. I taught last semester, but I'm on leave.
Because then I would really want to know how you're even like standing. Okay, so do you recall a moment or an early moment in your life where you felt how history, say the history you had been reading on your own, coursed through your life, that you actually understood the connection between the nation or even your locale's history and its impact on you as a young person?
There was never a time when it didn't. We grew up with storytellers in rural Maine, and you could not make sense of the world without understanding the stories that people told about the world. And from the very beginning, it was clear that people did not tell the same stories about the same events to me. And that was a real introduction to the intersection of what I love to do, the intersection of myth and reality, image and reality, And one of the things that I learned early on, both growing up on the coast of Maine, but then I was a waitress in Oklahoma, and I was the only person on the floor who was not an evangelical Christian. And they all hated Democrats more than anything on earth, and believed, literally one of them called me the Antichrist because I'd gone to Harvard. And they were cheering on Ronald Reagan even as he was cutting everything they needed to survive. Because we were living on waitress's minimum, which is $2.01 an hour at the time. And I remember cooking one Sunday, they let us use the restaurant when it was closed, to have food for this family when they were bringing a baby home from the hospital. And they're all in there talking about how much they hate Reagan and how important it is for everyone to make it on their own. And I'm like, they literally have no food in the house for this family. And you're cheering that on. And I thought, I got to understand the importance of ideas, because they are centering their lives around a set of ideas that do not reflect reality. So I would say those two things mostly.
And are those the things that led you to your study of history or to fall in love with it?
No, what led me to, yes, I mean, they were just part of my life. It wasn't like a study, it was just the world I lived in. No, what led me to history was, I say, I hated school.
Okay.
I've always hated school. And I took a course on the Civil War, and I had to write a final paper for Professor David Herbert Donald, who was my primary advisor. And I went down to the basement of GovDocs at Harvard, which at the time was underground and cold, and nobody was ever there except the phenomenal librarians and John Updike, and occasionally Bernard Balin, Professor Bernard Balin, and me. Like, there's nobody over there, because it's government documents, right? And so I went down there. It's before I got to know those people. And then I never got to know John Updike. I just knew who he was. And then I started reading the Chicago Tribune. I was like, I got to come up with a paper topic. So I went down. I don't eat breakfast. So I went down about 10 o'clock and started reading the Chicago Tribune for 1860, for the Civil War. And I read through the entire Chicago Tribune, which is only 4 pages, and 2 of them are advertising, so it's not as big a deal as it sounds. But I read through them, and it was one of those machines that you crank and you put your head in.
Yeah.
And so I read, and I was so into it, I read through lunch, so I hadn't eaten all day. And, you know, day by day, I went through the entire Civil War. And I got to the end, it's probably, GovDocs closed at like 11, so it's probably 9:30 or 10. And I turned the crank, and Lee surrendered. And of course, I knew the story, but believe me, no food, cold, dark, because it's all dark in there. And I'm living it, and Lee surrendered. And I'm like, oh my God, Lee surrendered. And then I turned the crank, and the Chicago Tribune was bordered in black. Oh. And they had shot Lincoln. And I was just like, oh my God, they shot my president. And I finished the war. I read through some more, but I realized it had come alive to me in a way that nothing ever had before. And I went home and I wrote a letter to my mother, and I said, because she was always into history, and I said, you're just not going to believe what happened today. And when she died, I found she had kept that letter. So that was it. Once that had happened, I applied for a grant, and Professor Donald got to be the advisor from that, and I finished my undergrad degree with him, and then he wanted me to keep me on as a PhD student, and I've never looked back.
Wow. So letters. Can you tell us the story of when, where were you, what were you doing, what were you thinking when you decided, hey, this thing called Substack, which at that point, I had never heard of, hardly anyone had ever heard of, I want to use that to write every day to whomever would be willing to read it.
I love how organized you make me sound. So what happened was I got stung by a bee, and I'm sorry, yellow jacket. I didn't have, my poor brother-in-law is here, and I was painting, and I asked him to come over because I was on a ladder. I won't be on a ladder without someone there, and I got stung by yellow jacket, and he said to me, oh my God, Heather. I was moving house. He said, I'll get your EpiPen. And I looked at him, I said, oh, Chris, you're not going to want to hear this. He goes, oh my God, you left your EpiPen at the other house. I'll go get it. And I said, oh, you're really not going to want to hear this. And he goes, you don't have an EpiPen, do you? And I was like, I never got it filled this year. And he goes, if you don't die, I'm going to kill you. So I had to sit and figure out, like, if I should go back to Boston and see what was going to happen with the stings. So I wrote a letter on Facebook. I had about 22,000 followers at the time, explaining where I thought the country was in that moment. And then all of a sudden, I was swamped with questions, and all of a sudden, my numbers started incredibly going up, and I thought, I guess I should answer some more questions. That was September 15th, 2019. I wrote again on September 17th, 2019, and I've written every night since. And after 3 weeks, I think my followers were several hundred thousand and climbing like that every day. And I remember writing to my dean and saying, something's going on over here, just so you know. And then my people started asking for a newsletter. And I literally said to my graduate students, what the expletive is a newsletter? Because that reminded me of PTO, when I was 7. And they looked into it and discovered that my numbers were already too high for any MailChimp or anything else to handle. We were in the hundreds of thousands. And right then Substack was starting, and they called me. And they said, we are watching what's happening on your Facebook page. We think you're a good fit. And I will tell you, I was on Substack for almost 2 years before I accepted money, because I never wanted to have to accept money for this. And they never once said to me that I was using their resources and they wanted something from me. And that they always were supportive, they always helped my people, and they never pushed me for however long it took. And that's one of the reasons I've never left Substack. So that's how I got onto Substack, and that's why I'm there. But they are literally, technologically, they're the only people who can handle more than, I send out well over 1 million emails a night. That's a lot of emails to send. They do send them in a number of batches, but they're the only people right now who can handle that. So if you're looking for a business, there you go.
I am also wondering if and when you decide to no longer do this, which I hope, I'm conflicted because I want you to sleep, but I hope it's not for quite some time. I was thinking, is Substack going to go out of business? I mean, what are they going to do without you? But okay, so we're still doing our meandering walk through your life here, and, and to that point, actually. Well, now that question has disappeared, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Someone from the audience wanted to know that they'd heard you were a Republican. Is that true? And if so, when and how did you shift?
So I love this. My answer to that is, and I am not being flippant, is that I am a historian. So today's modern politics doesn't mean, I won't say it doesn't mean a lot to me. It doesn't mean a lot to me personally, because my frame is just so much longer term than the present. So I don't identify with a political party in this moment. But I love the fact that I am accused of being both a shill for the Republicans and a shill for the Democrats, which says to me I'm probably doing something right.
So about the process that you undergo every single night, I mean, how do you do it? Can you describe a little bit about how you decide sort of what you're going to focus on in the letter, how you think through that thread that you pull through all the way from what had happened on that day to, I don't know, a century or 2 centuries ago? Where do you write? Do you have a beautiful, I guess, nighttime view of the Maine coastline? I mean, just tell me about that.
So just so you know, all my friends who are here, and my one of my children who's here are killing themselves laughing right now, because literally I'm like, in the car, like, in a storage room, at a coffee shop. No, so what I do is every morning I wake up and I reach my phone and I read a number of places to see what the stories are in the morning. What has happened overnight, what people think is important. And people send me tips. I don't have a staff or anything, but a lot of people know a lot of stuff and they send me information. Then I go about my day and do meetings and all the things that have to be done, and I continually check into the news. And usually there's a pretty clear story. So for example, I'm really proud of this actually, that I had a really strong sense that the administration was about to do something really big on the antitrust front. Mm-hmm. And so I actually started writing today's letter last night, because I knew that today, because I know history, was the anniversary of the establishment of the FTC. And even if it wasn't a big deal for today's FTC, which I thought it might be because Biden gave a number of really big speeches starting in July of 2021 about antitrust. And we've got Lena Khan at the FTC, so that you sort of felt like there was something that was going to happen there. I thought it was going to be a cool letter. It was going to be a historical letter, and that's why I wanted to write about Louis Brandeis, which would have been a very nice letter. Thank you very much. But then it was clear that at about 12:15 today, when the news dropped about the lawsuit against Amazon, that's a big story. And then Biden standing in a picket line. I know that's never happened before. That's a big story. But so normally what I do is see what's out there, and really they're usually only one or two stories. And then you sit there and you say, if I were teaching a class about this, why would I say that they are important? And then, and often I can't do that. Those are the really hard nights when there's a lot of information and it's really scattered. And then literally I sit there and say, if it were 150 years from now, what would I want to know?
Yeah.
And that's literally how I make the choice of what to put where. But I think is interesting is when you do that, there are themes. And I don't design those themes. But when I looked back over, for something else, I had to read the letters for a period of time, and I'm like, darn it, that guy keeps coming back. Chris Krebs, the guy who does the election security.
Yep.
When the first time he appeared, did you think he was going to be a recurring character? Cassidy Hutchinson?
Yeah. By the way, I'm just going to shamelessly plug On Point because we did a 5-part series on monopolies in America last year. Time has likely lost most of its meaning to me, but I think it's last year. For the same reasons that you just described, that there are things that keep coming back. And so looking at monopoly today, and a lot of that series actually also was like, okay, the last great antitrust, the trust-busting era of the United States, what lines can we draw? So listen to it. Okay, so here's another question from the audience. How do we maintain relationships with loved ones on the, quote, wrong side?
Well, I don't have any great degrees or ideas about psychology. I would say that one of the things that really jumps out to me is how many people actually agree about many things and are artificially divided. So, your loved ones are your loved ones. Focus on gardening or whatever you can share. One of the things that I said to somebody once about this is it's rather, when I talk to people who are unable to leave their political prejudices behind, even in personal relationships, it's somewhat like having a friend who's in an abusive relationship, and you can see it and they cannot. And the worst thing you can possibly do is to say, I really don't like her, she's abusive. What you really want to do is maintain that relationship and model a healthy relationship. And that's sort of what I do when I look at politics, is not say, your guy sucks, but literally say, I don't think it's okay when the police throw somebody in the back of a van and break their backs, which is much more common ground, I think.
So you are essentially doing the work that most, not all, but most of the media is not, right?
It's a different job, what I do.
I don't think so. People turn to you every morning when they get up and read the newsletter as their primary source of news for the morning. At least folks who I've talked to that read the letters. And I do think you're doing the work of journalism that more in the media should do. And I'll tell you why. Because Dan Frumkin, who's a media critic, as you know, I think his website's called Press Watchers.
Can I just say, losing Eric Boehlert was, if you don't know who Eric Boehlert was, he was one of the best press watchers ever, and he was tragically killed in a bicycle accident 2 years ago.
I think so.
His loss is still haunts us, and Dan, of course, has really picked up the slack.
Yeah. So I misstated the website. It's presswatch.org, I think. He recently had a post where he had asked journalists that he respects. Like, how should the 2024 election be covered? And we generated a list. And on the list it said, well, don't cover the horse race, provide readers with context, examine the implications of policy suggestions or ideas, not just sort of who's offering the policy suggestion, incorporate history into the stories.
That wasn't me.
Focus on the how and the why, not the who. And I mean, the list went on, and as I was looking at it, I just thought, well, that is exactly what you do, right? I don't think you were thinking of that consciously, like, here are the ways that I need to put all this information and my historical knowledge together. But why do you think that that's kind of where your letters landed? Because that might be a tough one, because I'm guessing this all comes naturally to you. And I'm very taken by the fact that you asked yourself, what would I want to read 150 years from now? So maybe let me change the question. Why do you think someone like you is doing that work rather than, again, with some exceptions, WBUR, right? The majority of the media is not.
That's an easier way to answer it, because one of the things that really jumps out to me, and we have very good journalists in this country, a number of very good journalists in this country, and it's a very hard job. What I do is really not a hard job, because the news is there for me. I need to make sense of it, but I don't have to find it. Sometimes I find it, but they don't make it difficult. I mean, you can read state.gov and figure out exactly what the State Department is doing, or you can do the same thing with virtually any piece of the government. And, Americans never shut up. So if you want to, literally, you can Google, something you really want to know, and there's 15 people talking about it in one magazine or another. The Defense Department is great about just chatting about stuff. So what they do is much harder because they got to get the story. For me, it's already there. But I do think there is an issue with the depth of training. So if you think of the great old journalists, Murrow, for example, or Cronkite, their knowledge of other countries, their knowledge was just so freaking deep that when they were live on camera and, somebody would get assassinated, they would say, well, we have seen this coming since 47 years ago when, they tripped coming out of the elevator and knocked that guy into the dessert tray. And you're like, really? And we just don't have that now, simply because people don't have that extraordinarily broad education, and also the time to spend doing nothing but learning about the different pieces of the world. Maybe.
Well, again, one of the great joys and challenges in talking with you is we could go in so many different directions, but I will try to stay on topic here. So let me turn back to an audience question. Is it valuable to soften some of my beliefs to move forward incrementally, or can we keep fighting for radical change when the pendulum swings so harshly?
I don't think it's fair that you can see the questions and I can't. So that's the question, right? Like, do you the whole thing is politics a bus? So you just take the bus that's going closest to where you want it to go, or do you have to push for change? And I'm going to be a total Libra here and say they are both important. Because the reality is politics is never what you want it to be. It is literally a question of getting somebody in power, not just in office, but in power, who will move that bus in the right direction. But we need the radicals everywhere to put pressure on those people driving the bus. So this is a fight that kind of makes me a little bit bonkers, because people will say, oh, you people aren't trying hard enough, or oh, you people are too radical. And the truth is, we need both of those people. And a great example of that, of course, is women's suffrage. One of the ways that people like Julia Ward Howe or Lucy Stone could get attention for their desire for the vote was by saying, if you don't give it to us here, you're going to have to deal with those people out there chaining themselves to the fence. And I'm mixing a lot of eras here, but Woodrow Wilson is like, okie dokie. I'm not dealing with the guys out there, those people out there chaining themselves to the fence. I'm happy to deal with you nice ladies with your pearls. And that was a 1-2 punch that I think is really true for many of our successes in terms of social movements.
Well, getting back to your concern about politics at the state level, gerrymandering, et cetera, is that 1-2 punch but even effective anymore in America now if politicians literally do not have to answer at all to half the electorate?
Well, we're mixing a couple of things there. And the answer, I mean, you can extrapolate what I just said to the idea, for example, of the civil rights movement, but you could also say the same thing with any kind of political rights. You need to have the people fighting piece by piece in the courts, for sure, but you also need to have people putting vocal pressure on the courts, on politicians to make those changes. So, one of the things that's really interesting to me right now is the fact that there was a lot of chatter, which I did not repeat because of where the chatter was, that Alabama was deliberately not pushing forward its required redistricting maps because they expected that Brett Kavanaugh was going to go ahead and switch his vote and let them get away with the maps that they wanted to get away with without the second black majority district. Today, they did the opposite. Why? Why does the Supreme Court today seem to be moderating some of its more extreme impulses? That's a story that is not done yet. Just the same way that the New Deal courts backed off from their extremism when it looked as if they were going to get packed.
I mean, so maybe they do have a slight sense of shame because confidence in the Supreme Court is cratering.
Yes, maybe they do.
John Roberts
maybe
really cares about the legacy of the court.
And maybe they don't. I mean, maybe they do, maybe they don't. But there is a movement there, and I do not think it is unreasonable to say that the fury over, let's call it Justice Thomas, is making perhaps some of the younger justices think, maybe we better back off a little bit on some of our stances. That and Dobbs.
Maybe we shouldn't accept flights and vacations from people who are going to have their lawyers in front of the court.
Maybe, he liked his oatmeal that day. And so, I mean, we don't know. This is the point of being a historian, right? I'd love to give you all the answers. We don't know what that's going to look like. But it is not unreasonable to think that popular disgust with the current Supreme Court has made it move a little bit away from its extremes.
So I've been turning a question over and over in my head, and I don't know how to phrase it. So I'm going to be groping around here a little bit. How would you describe how your love for country manifests itself in what you do every day?
So my love for this country is based in my belief in the concept of human self-determination as a fundamental goal for humanity. That's really what drives me, the idea that people should have the right and the ability to make their own decisions about their own lives. And that's a moralist, I think, and a humanist belief. It manifests itself in the United States because I believe that democracy has the potential, that's an important caveat, to be a government that gives the most people that right. And believing that then makes me really interested in the individuals who have advanced that goal, and usually who have advanced that goal somewhat inadvertently, and who, again, to speak as a humanist more than as a historian, who have advanced that goal despite their own flaws. Because at the end of the day, that's the story of humanity. So I care deeply about American history. I care deeply about how we got to where we are. But I think fundamentally it's a question of caring deeply about humans. And that caring for humans and caring for each other is, I think, the bridge that makes this, what I am now believing is a movement, not only address the problems that we have in today's United States society, but that also offers a way forward that is much more just than we have had in our past.
Yeah, really appreciate that, because as I was walking to work this morning, I was thinking about, I'm 47, so most of my life has been spent under the aegis of the revolution brought in by Ronald Reagan, right? And so when Reagan said, government's the problem, right? Or Margaret Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society. I grew up in a world where for many, many years, the news wouldn't talk about American citizens' confidence is X. It would talk about consumer confidence, right? So kind of growing up in a stew where you define yourself as an American, whether consciously or unconsciously, probably more unconsciously, not as a human who's supposed to care for your fellow human, your fellow American, but as a consumer whose self-satisfaction is your primary reason for loving this country. And I think we're pulling ourselves out of that. And that's one of the places that I seek light. Because the movements that we've seen on the street, and I mean, I'm a Gen Xer, sorry, we could have done better, but with younger generations is really, it's about taking care of each other. Do you think that is gaining enough momentum that we can start, rethinking of what it actually means to be not just a citizen, but a resident of the United States, to really proudly proclaim love of country, no matter where you are in the political spectrum? I do.
And I think there are a number of places that show that, which I'm happy to talk about. But one of the things that I would be doing were I more organized, I'm really good at talking about American citizenship, not as being a consumer, because I'm so bad at being a consumer. I cannot tell you. It's like I intended to be wearing a flag pin, but I forgot it. So, it's been to tell people, the idea that we have ceded patriotism to a group of radical extremists, because today's Republicans are not within the American mainstream. They are not. They're radical extremists, is appalling to me. I mean, to be an American patriot means believing in a country that defends equality before the law, which is something noble. And I feel like it's time for us to take that back. To fly our flags and to wear our flag pins if we can remember them, and to recognize that that's what this country has always been at its best. And in that, I am not seeing anything that we haven't done before. Quite literally, this is where the populist movement came from. And like this current moment, the populist movement came from a place where the people in Washington simply had no idea what was happening. There's this wonderful moment when, in the election of 1890, when the alliance movement is rising in the American West and the American South, there's a bunch of letters that are going back to the president and to politicians back in Washington going, hey, guys, we've got a problem back here. Ooh, we got a problem. We're not even running a candidate because we're not going to win. And the Republicans who expected to clean up in that election were like, yeah, whatever, who cares? And in the election of 1890, when the Republicans thought they were going to win in spades, the Democrats and the alliance movement took the House of Representatives by a margin of 2-1 and took control of the Senate. And there's this wonderful letter that this lady writes about visiting Benjamin Harrison, the president, and she says, he just wandered around the yard going, the garden going, I don't know what happened. I don't understand what happened. I don't get what happened. All I know is it wasn't my fault. But that all happened under the radar screen. New newspapers, new meetings, new political movements, all these things. And literally most of those newspapers don't even survive. We know that they existed, but South Dakota, which started that movement, started all the new newspapers. There are none of those newspapers extant now.
But nevertheless, through that, even with those other aspects of history, you see progress.
Oh, in this moment, yeah. I mean, my point there is that there are a ton of underground not underground. I mean, we're operating above ground, but like people aren't paying attention to us. And one of the things that really that are organizing. One of the things that interested me the other day is when we were talking about a headline in a newspaper, and how many people had read the headline in that newspaper, and how people had gotten the wrong impression from it. And I thought, that's true, and that's really bad. But are more people reading me? And I think the answer is probably yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Several years ago, I sat down and read the Declaration with my daughter. And I still think it's one of the most magnificent documents ever written. And I was like really getting excited again, reading it, because it's not perfect. And of course, the man and men who wrote it were not perfect either. But the idea, speaking of humanism, right, the idea that's captured in it is worth saving, right? It's worth fighting for. And so, I mean, I'm wildly patriotic, to be perfectly honest. That came to me through my parents who chose this country. Mm-hmm. And so it is quite inspiring to hear you say that despite all the very significant challenges to our democracy that we're currently being faced with, that it's worth fighting for. But people want to know, like, how do you maintain your optimism about that? How do you maintain your positivity? How do you maintain the willingness to hold fast?
Because I know we've done it before. And one of the things that, and because people are nice. I mean, you either believe people are good or you believe they're not. And I believe people are good. Not all of them, but most people are good. And we haven't been vocal enough about that for a long time. And people are starting to do that again. And again, we have been in situations like this before, but one of the things that I really like people to understand is that I think there has been a sense that societies are saved by that one brilliant person. And one of the ways we've taught civil rights history worries me a bit, because it's always like, these great people who arose and did these great things. And the truth is that people become heroes because they do the right thing one day after another. And one of my favorite stories is about 4 women who became known as the Angels of the Underground in the Philippine movement in World War II, the movement to save the Philippines in World War II. And you're like, wow, 4 ladies, they saved the underground in the Philippines, right? This is a really big deal. Literally, one of them becomes the hero of the Philippines, because when she goes to get enrolled by the Japanese, not knowing that they're going to be taking everybody away, they say, we're going to just write your names down, you can go home. She goes to have her name written down, and she has a panic attack. So she can't stay in the room. And everybody's like, oh, just stay for 10 more minutes and then you can go home. And she's like, I can't, I'm having a panic attack. She goes home. Of course, everybody else gets rounded up. And there she is in her apartment all alone. She's got nothing to do. So she peeks out the window and watches what the Japanese soldiers are doing for weeks. So she knows all their movements. And it's like she did not wake up and say, I am going to be the hero of the Philippines. She woke up and said, God, I'm having a panic attack. I can't do this very simple thing I need to do. And so she went home, and circumstances put her in a place to become one of the Angels of the Underground. And that's kind of, I think, the story of life. Nobody wakes up and says, I am going to save humanity today. They wake up and say, I'm going to put food on the table. And on the way, maybe I'm going to, save a child from a speeding train or whatever, but I'm just going to do the right thing again and again and again. And if enough of us do the right thing again and again and again, we come out with a really good outcome.
Well, there are so many more questions that I could ask you, but we're out of time. So Heather, I just want to end with this thought of profound gratitude. Not just thanks, but gratitude to you for the work you're doing, for the knowledge that you're spreading, for the way that you're teaching all of us these lessons, which we can immediately incorporate into our lives again at a time where more of us than ever need them. So I can't thank you enough. And even though I still want you to get a lot of sleep, I hope that the letters keep coming, even past the election. So thank you very much.
Well,
Heather.
we'll see. Thank you. And I would like to say, I would actually like to thank not only Meghna, who I did not realize I had met you so recently. I actually thought it's been a long time. But one of the things about this book, Democracy Awakening, is that I thought I was writing a book, and I put it aside when Buddy and I got married. And when I went back and read it, I discovered it was not the book that I thought I had written. It was the book that my readers had written. So I rewrote about 80% of it, and the book is dedicated to the people who read me, because it really is theirs as much as it is mine. So this whole thing has felt like a family enterprise, and I wanted to start here at BUR because this is family. I've been here working, doing one thing or another for, I guess, only 10 years. It sure seemed like longer than that. And the audience is full of my friends and my family, and obviously everybody who thinks this enterprise is worth doing. So thank you very much to WBUR for having me, and to Meghna for doing this, and for everybody for coming. And, let's go out and keep the faith.
I don't want to stop that. Heather Cox Richardson, Meghna Chakrabarti. First of all, I think you just made the entire room totally misty-eyed. Thank you. Thank you for starting this book tour with us. And thank you for shedding so much light on so much in such a relentlessly fascinating way tonight. I know we could have gone on and on and on. I had in my notes that I wanted to say thank you to two of the most brilliant women in Boston, and that we should give them another round of applause. But I decided we should say thank you to two of the most brilliant people on the planet, and give them another round of applause. And I also, it's really important to me, I mean, Heather just said this, but to turn to all of you, and I know a lot of you made your way through a heck of a lot of traffic to get here tonight. I hope it's much less bad on the way home. But I also want to thank all of you for turning out. And a standing ovation in this room, that's a big deal. I don't know that I've ever seen that happen before. I want to say, if you want to come back for more brilliance, a week from tomorrow, Steve Inskeep, the host of NPR's Morning Edition, who's not a historian who some people think of as a journalist, but a journalist who sort of found himself being an historian, is back here to talk about his new book with Meghna, and it's called Differ We Must: How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America. And so in some ways it will sound similar themes as we did tonight. Our team is standing by just outside. If you want to sign up to come see Steve, we'd love to have you here. We'd love you to sign up for the CitySpace event newsletter. And yesterday, I don't know how many books you signed, but Heather signed lots and lots and lots and lots of books for all of you, and they're outside for sale. So thank you all so much. Thank you two so much. Have a wonderful evening.